All right. Welcome in, Facebook. Good morning. We've said that to each other, but now that you're live, we're going to say it to you too. I got Ruth. Today's text is Ruth chapter 1, verses 6 through 18, and then verse 22. Ruth's definitely a story that most people are aware of. I think, Jamie, didn't you tell me it was your favorite or one of your favorites? One of her favorites. So we'll dig into that today. Excuse me. I'm probably going to do that a lot, but I'll read the text first, and then we'll go into lesson context and start breaking out the verses. Starting again, it's Ruth chapter 1, verses 6 through 18, and then verse 22. So starting with verse 6. When Naomi heard in Moab that the Lord had come to the aid of his people by providing food for them, she and her daughters-in-law prepared to return home from there. With her two daughters-in-law, she left the place where she had been living and set out on the road that would take them back to the land of Judah. Then Naomi said to her two daughters-in-law, "Go back, each of you, to your mother's home. May the Lord show you kindness as you have shown kindness to your dead husbands and to me. May the Lord grant that each of you will find rest in the home of another husband." Then she kissed them goodbye, and they wept aloud and said to her, "We will go back with you to your people." But Naomi said, "Return home, my daughters. Why would you come with me? Am I going to have more sons who could become your husbands? Return home, my daughters. I am too old to have another husband. Even if I thought there was still hope for me, even if I had a husband tonight and then gave birth to sons, would you wait until they grew up? Would you remain unmarried for them? No, my daughters, it is more bitter for me than for you, because the Lord's hand has turned against me." At this they wept aloud again. Then Orpah kissed her mother-in-law goodbye, but Ruth clung to her. "Look," said Naomi, "your sister-in-law is going back to her people and her gods. Go back with her." But Ruth replied, "Don't urge me to leave you or to turn back from you. Where you go, I will go, and where you stay, I will stay. Your people will be my people, and your God my God. Where you die, I will die, and there I will be buried. May the Lord deal with me, be it ever so severely, if even death separates you and me." When Naomi realized that Ruth was determined to go with her, she stopped urging her. Verse 22. So Naomi returned from Moab, accompanied by Ruth the Moabite and her daughter-in-law, arriving in Bethlehem as the barley harvest was beginning. So I want to read the before and after. It said, tragedy creates a before and an after. Before the job loss, the accident, the fight, after the breakup, the death, etc. When tragedy strikes, we might question God's sovereignty or fear that he is using strength to punish us through our pain. No matter how strong our faith, tragedy can leave us raw and feeling we are merely surviving. Reading the stories of tragedy found within the Bible can offer comfort. When we see examples of how others remain faithful to God, we are inspired to persevere. And even more, when we see how God demonstrated his faithfulness to others, we can regain confidence in his provision no matter our current circumstance. We don't need easy answers in pain. We need God's love, often expressed through the love of other believers. Ruth's story is one biblical example of love expressed in the after time of tragedy. So in lesson context, the lesson context for the book of Ruth is it's a very well-known book, but as far as being able to nail down the time frame, it's kind of all over the place. It says the author of the book of Ruth is unknown. The date of composition has been proposed as early as King Solomon's reign, which is approximately 970 to 930 BC, to as late as 250 BC, long after the return from Babylonian exile. This huge range speaks to the many factors one might point to as evidence of an earlier or later date, as well as the text's own ambivalence concerning these questions. So that's a pretty wide frame. If you look at the closest, the 930 BC, and then to as late as 250 BC, it's almost a 700-year range. The setting of events within Ruth are comparatively much better defined as occurring during the time of the judges. That is sometime between 1373 and 1043 BC. The conquest of Canaan was complete with the Israelite tribes settled in the land, but the Israelites experienced oppression from outside nations, Moab occasionally being one of them. The Moabites were descended from Abraham's nephew Lot. Conflict with Moab was already ancient by the time of the judges in Israel. Unsurprisingly, perhaps, the Moabites were banned from entering the assembly of the Lord through marriage to Moabites was not banned specifically, though marriage to Moabites was not banned specifically. Despite these deep antipathies, a persistent famine in Israel motivated a certain Naomi's Israelite family to leave Bethlehem and settle in Moab. 10 years are covered quickly in the text, apparently beginning with the death of Naomi's husband, Elimelech, and ending with the death of her sons. In the meantime, these two sons had married Moabite women, Ruth and Orpah, before leaving them childless with their untimely deaths. Widowhood was an especially precarious state for women. In the ancient Near East, including both Moab and Israel, men had far more economic power than women. A woman left without male relatives to care for her could be reduced to abject poverty, and prostitution might result. Fathers or sons were the best line of defense to protect widows. In the case of younger widows, this protection lasted until new husbands could be found. God had given Israel specific instructions for caring for widows, both within the family and the larger community. So they're all kind of in the same place here. Ruth's lost her husband, she's lost her two sons, and her daughters-in-law are widows as well. And that last paragraph where it talks about the situation that women would find themselves in as widows, plays throughout this text. We'll start going into the verses. Verse 6. When Naomi heard in Moab that the Lord had come to the aid of his people by providing food for them, she and her daughters-in-law prepared to return home from there. It says, returning to her people was Naomi's best option to be cared for in her widowed state. And God's renewed provision in her homeland meant that her family's legal obligations to care for her would not burden an already famished community. This inclusion of her daughters-in-law might surprise us, as their families of origin would be expected to care for them in their widowhood. This tension drives the action to come. So Naomi's in a foreign land to speak. Her daughters-in-law, this is their home country. But for her to be provided for, her best option is to go back to her home country, which doesn't necessarily apply to her daughter. It's kind of a split decision here. In verse 7, with her two daughters-in-law, she left the place where she had been living and set out on the road that would take them back to the land of Judah. It says there's no clear indication regarding how soon after her son's deaths Naomi received news that the famine in Judah had ended. For Naomi, the journey back to the land of Judah was a return to her family and the safety net that they represented. But using the same rationale of familial obligation and care, Naomi's two daughters-in-law would have been expected to stay in their homeland, Moab. That the Moabite women began this journey with their mother-in-law speaks to the depth of their love for and devotion to her. Traveling with Naomi potentially put her well-being over the younger widow's own future prospects for marriage and family. Following her initially may also indicate that the daughters-in-law were not thinking clearly, stricken as they were by grief at the tremendous loss that had suffered with Naomi. So they're, like it stated, we don't know exactly what time period this is as far as the deaths of her husband and her sons, but this is that time after tragedy where it's raw emotion, especially for her daughters-in-law. Verse 8a. Then Naomi said to her daughters-in-law, "Go back, each of you, to your mother's home." We might have expected Naomi to urge the young widows back to their father's home. As it said, typically having a male being under a father's care would provide for more economic opportunity. So that's what that references. But returning each to her mother's home might mark a subtle shift in focus from the material benefit of marriage to the relational, or it may be a tacit acknowledgement of polygamy. In this case, the mother's house would be a separate dwelling from the father's primary residence. More than these options, though, the language suggests that Naomi was relinquishing her rights to any support her two daughters-in-law might offer her. She was not their mother, and because of that, they were not obligated to share in the difficulties that widowhood would represent for Naomi. So she's trying to look out for them. She's trying to say, you don't have to take care of me. I'm going back to my homeland. You go do what's best for you. She's trying to make it easy. You can kind of get the interpretation that, while the daughters-in-law are grief-stricken, she's kind of the one that's got that clarity. She's trying to, formulate that plan. 8b and 9a. May the Lord show you kindness as you have shown kindness to your dead husbands and to me. May the Lord grant that each of you will find rest in the home of another husband." Then she kissed them goodbye. As Moabite widows, Ruth and Orpah would be incredibly vulnerable in Israel. Naomi's words, "show you kindness," have a ring of covenant language. She intended to leave the women in the Lord's care, even though she also intended to leave them in the land of Moab. Naomi did not explicitly say, but clearly believed that the Lord was not only able, but also willing to bless the younger widows, even outside of Israel. As it is true throughout the book, the Lord's kindness would be experienced through human relationships. Rest for the widows was expected to be found in their mothers' homes before moving on to new families and the houses of new husbands. Naomi's future was far from assured. The gift she felt she could give her daughters-in-law was to free them to find more likely sources of stability than she could offer. Excuse me. In a typical farewell gesture, Naomi sealed her hopes for them with a kiss. It signified her love and what she expected to be her final act of care for them. So again, like we said, she's trying to continue the relationship she had by caring for them. It's not to put her needs above theirs. She's trying to be selfless. Verses 9b and 10, and they wept aloud and said to her, "We will go back with you to your people." They wept aloud is clearly lament language. In context, it would be for the general position in which they all found themselves. They're all, grieving. They're, as it says, they're husbandless and with uncertain futures. Or it could specifically have been in response to the pain these two younger women felt at the thought of separating from Naomi. "We will go back with you to your people" does not constitute a binding oath, but does communicate great devotion to Naomi. It was not a pragmatic response or a thought-out plan. It was the pleading of two daughters-in-law who didn't want to see their mother-in-law leave. So you can kind of see their outlook on it, whereas Naomi's kind of laid it out that they would be better served to go back to their home country and she to hers. They don't want that change, though. They've already gone through, when you go through that period of immense change, you just cling to something that's stable, and that's, to them, that's the relationship they have with her. And I think it does show the devotion that they have with her. You can kind of, it paints the relationship. Verse 11, "But Naomi said, 'Return home, my daughters. Why would you come with me? Am I going to have more sons who could become your husbands?'" And it says here, Naomi asked her daughters, which is a subtle change from the daughters-in-law designation up to this point, literally to turn from their current course and return to their mother's homes. Naomi emphasized the darker, more painful truth about her motivation to send them away. She could not bear any more sons to grow up and care for her dead sons' wives. This concern was in keeping with a provision within the law of Moses concerning care for widows. The brother of the widow's deceased husband was required to marry the widow in a levirate marriage. This not only ensured care for the widow, but also allowed her dead husband's lineage to continue. Due to Naomi's own widowhood and age, she knew that she would not provide new husbands for Orpah and Ruth. It says Naomi saw clearly, and in parentheses, if erroneously, the end of her family line. Verses 12 and 13. "Return home, my daughters. I am too old to have another husband. Even if I thought there was still hope for me, even if I had a husband tonight and then gave birth to sons, would you wait until they grew up? Would you remain unmarried for them?" Excuse me. The phrase, "I am too old to have another husband," continued the reality check for the two daughters. She's trying to come at this from, a pragmatic approach. She's laying out the case for why, what she's asking them to do is the best case for everybody. Naomi's childbearing years were behind her, such that no man of her times would be inclined to marry her. And even if she had hoped that she could remarry that very day and conceive sons that night, how could the widows be expected to wait years for those sons to be old enough to marry? These hypothetical sons wouldn't be ready for marriage until their early 20s, likely putting Ruth and Orpah somewhere in their 40s. Even today, a pregnancy is considered geriatric after the age of 35. I think 50 is the new 35 these days. Back then as now, pregnancy at that age and beyond was increasingly unlikely and dangerous. Return home emphasizes the benefit of Ruth and Orpah's rejoining their families of origin in Moab. Remarriage in Moab was thus the best option for Ruth and Orpah's flourishing after being widowed. Their families were invested in their well-being and could arrange marriage contracts for their widowed daughters. Naomi's care would be more easily obtained if she did not come home with two grown female dependents. So I was going to touch on this in a little bit, but you can kind of, through her words, kind of feel Naomi saying, you still have a future. You can kind of sense a little bit. If you read between the lines, you can kind of sense that bitterness, and it touches on that in the next verse. 13b, no, my daughters, it is more bitter for me than for you, because the Lord's hand has turned against me. The Lord's hand can refer to God's blessing, guidance, and protection, but his hand conversely can refer to curse, discipline, and judgment. Turned against me illustrates Naomi's feeling that God had not so much abandoned her, rather he was judging her. The writer does not outright confirm or deny Naomi's feeling, but when she returned home, Naomi asked to be called Mara, which means bitter. Because the Almighty has made my life very bitter. We can make too much of the fact that the writer never called Naomi Mara, but it subtly suggests that the writer did not accept that Naomi's life was bitter, or at least that it wasn't irretrievably bitter. Ascribing motivations to God is a dangerous business. We need only Job to be reminded of this. But in the middle of so much grief, one way of arriving at meaning, either legitimately or illegitimately, is to find God's judgment in pain. We do well to remember that we cannot know why God allows hard circumstances. We are wise to remember that his ways are not ours, and his thoughts are above ours. And we can rest in the hope that God uses all things to our benefit if we place our hope in him, regardless of our circumstances. So in the circumstance that she's in, when we think back on times where you can have that feeling where, what did I do? Why am I in this place? You automatically assume that this is punishment somehow. And that's her mindset. Dressed in Christ. This is one of the inserts. At the end of our street, my trick-or-treating children and I met an elderly woman sitting in a lawn chair, a bowl of candy in her lap. Trick-or-treat, the children called. Unexpectedly, the woman began to cry. Oh, what's wrong? I asked. She replied, my husband passed away, and this is my first time passing out treats without him. He loved seeing the children in their costumes. My children spontaneously hugged the woman, and we prayed for her. I had been reluctant to allow my children to go trick-or-treating, but even in costumes, we were all dressed in Christ to meet our new friend, who in their distress needs to experience Christ through you. So I feel like we talk about this a lot in Sunday school lessons. I feel like it always kind of tends to arrive at the point where our job is to be consistent, because you don't ever know the person that you come across that day, what their situation is. And it goes back to, that phone call that Donna just mentioned, that was, you can say everything's a coincidence, but then when you look at it, the angle that we've looked at it, we're put where we're put every day, every moment for a reason. So we have to maximize that. I'm sorry. I'm going to do this for at least 10 more verses. Verse 14. As at this, they wept aloud again. Then Orpah kissed her mother-in-law goodbye, but Ruth clung to her. At first, Orpah and Ruth had responded in unified lament following Naomi's goodbye kiss. But then Orpah kissed Naomi. As with Naomi's previous gesture, this was a kiss goodbye. We might be tempted to conclude that Orpah acted faithlessly toward Naomi, but the text does not indicate here or elsewhere that Orpah made a poor decision. She acted in keeping with the wisdom of her time and with Naomi's greatest hopes for Orpah's future thriving. By contrast, Ruth would not be swayed by any argument Naomi could make. Ruth clung to her and would not change her mind. So in all the pleading that Naomi's done with them to go back to their home country, Orpah kind of finally accepted the reality of the situation. But you see now the contrast between Orpah and Ruth. Verse 15. Look, said Naomi, your sister-in-law is going back to her people and her gods. Go back with her. Naomi made one last plea to Ruth to turn back. Returning to her people would be a comfortable cultural fit for Ruth, complete with a return to worship of Moabite gods. In the ancient world, gods were often associated not only with certain spheres of activity, which is agricultural, military, etc., but also with geographic regions. The principal deity worshipped in Moab was the detestable Chemosh. The Israelites were meant to be distinct from their neighbors by rejecting all gods other than the Lord, never worshiping a pantheon of multiple deities. Ruth's choice was between what she had known before and what she had come to know in her husband's household. So, this kind of last pleading that Naomi has is, you think about, not only if she follows her to her home country, she's leaving behind, the culture that she knows. It's like we can kind of place ourselves in that situation, going somewhere where you feel like you're starting from scratch, nothing. So that's kind of the last angle that she takes here before Ruth kind of takes over. Verses 16 and 17a. But Ruth replied, "Don't urge me to leave you or to turn back from you. Where you go, I will go. Where you stay, I will stay. Your people will be my people, and your God, my God. Where you die, I will die, and there I will be buried." The introductory statement is an emphatic statement of Ruth's immovable will to follow Naomi, strengthened by Ruth's listings of her commitments to Naomi. Ruth's response reflected Naomi's hopes for Ruth, but unexpectedly anticipated their fulfillment to be found in a future that included the two women together. The commitment to Naomi's people and God directly tied back to Naomi's plea for Ruth to follow Orpah's example. The commitments to go and stay with Naomi tied Ruth's future to Naomi's. Whatever provision Naomi would find among her people, Ruth would accept as well. Naomi would expect to die well before Ruth, yet Ruth's commitment was to die in Judah and be buried there. In these ways, Ruth declared Naomi to be her mother and outlined the devotion that she would demonstrate as Naomi's true child. So you see the relationship here does reflect more of a mother-daughter relationship than a daughter-in-law, mother-in-law relationship. She's clinging to her like a child would her mother. Verses 17b and 18. May the Lord deal with me, be it ever so severely, if even death separates you and me. When Naomi realized that Ruth was determined to go with her, she stopped urging her. She gets it now. There's not anything else she can say to sway. Unlike Orpah and Ruth's spontaneous declaration in Ruth 1:10, this is the most solemn of vows. Ruth had carefully considered the cost of going with Naomi. Realizing this, Naomi stopped trying to convince Ruth to take a different journey. I think Naomi probably gets now too that Ruth's not just speaking from raw emotion, that she means this. She's making a commitment. And then verse 22. So Naomi returned from Moab, accompanied by Ruth the Moabite, her daughter-in-law, arriving in Bethlehem as the barley harvest was beginning. It says Bethlehem can be literally translated as house of bread, giving an ironic cast to the famine that had occurred there. It says drought was a likely cause of the famine, as rain clouds would sometimes pass straight over Bethlehem and climb to higher elevations such as Moab before bursting. The women's westward journey from Moab around the northern shore of the Dead Sea apparently passed without incident. The mention of the barley harvest confirmed that the famine was broken. The beginning of that harvest took place sometime in mid-March to mid-April. In later Jewish tradition, the book of Ruth was read at the Festival of Weeks in celebration of God's provision of the harvest. The second insert was called Catching a Vision. Janice and Wendy met in a widow's support group and became friends instantly. Janice had not been active in her faith for many years until Wendy started inviting her to church events. Together, they joined a women's Bible study and served on their church's mission team. There they started to catch a vision for world missions. A visiting missionary who had served many years in Turkey began sharing with them how many widows and orphans had migrated from Syria and Iraq as the result of the civil wars. Neither of the women had formal training as missionaries or in the Bible, but they could give smiles and hugs and share tears with women who had been through losses similar to their own. Janice and Wendy departed for Turkey and began learning the language and the culture. They bonded with dozens of women who had endured severe hardship. God fulfills his promise to set the lonely in families. Are you in a position now to be brought into a family or to invite others into yours? Ask the Lord for eyes to see the harvest he has set before you. So to me, what this is saying is you're not talking about blood families. You're talking about shared circumstance. And, no matter across oceans, people in similar circumstances can feel similar emotions. So, it's not just your family that you can care for and that you can provide for. It's being able to share the emotion and share that empathy. In conclusion, walk with one another. We are created to be in community with God and with others. Ruth's faithfulness to the Lord and to Naomi is an example to all of what living and loving in community might require of us. Ruth's words and actions demonstrated true commitment to carrying Naomi's burdens. Showing up in the midst of pain and anguish is difficult, especially if we are dealing with our own feelings of loss. How we respond to tragedy will determine whether we are following Ruth's example as she followed Christ's example without even knowing her many times great grandson. So you think about it, the end result of tragedy, we can be kind of, it can be tunnel vision. All you can kind of focus on is your grief, your emotions. But I think, it's kind of like I've always heard it, you're riding the wave. And, as you take a wave in, it can throw you all over the place. It can be smooth. It can be a rough ride. But at the end of it, if you kind of stay with it, you end up on the shore, you end up on your feet. So I think that's kind of a macrocosm of, this story. But there's a lot psychologically and spiritually to pull out of Ruth's story. I think that's why it's, everybody's favorite. But that's all for the text. But I'll open it up. If anybody else has anything they want to share about Ruth. And if not, everybody have a good week.